All right, everybody, welcome back to week 4 of our Friday Learning Series. I've actually really enjoyed making these, thinking through the process of how to scaffold all this. Again, if this is your first time checking this out, go back to the first week, start there and build up. By the time you're done with today, you'll be at about an hour of professional learning. And sure, count this towards your professional learning certificate, towards your renewal. Go ahead, you're learning, you're thinking, you're growing, you're conversing, you're talking, you're debating. It's okay. You know, I say this very honestly and humbly. What I tell you is not the gospel. You know, I'm not writing the transcription here. My words are not in red. You do not have to just take it because Schmittou has said it. I want you to wrestle with this stuff. I want you to debate it, discuss it. It's totally fine and totally appropriate. But I want the conversations to happen. The goal is to try to elevate our educational experience for all of our kids here, kindergarten through 12th grade, helping all of our kids really get college and career ready, and helping them create new opportunities by showing success on the standardized tests. That whether or not you believe in the idea of standardized tests or not, we'll talk about that at another time. The methodologies and the strategies that we're discussing right now are proven to help our kids demonstrate success. So, just a quick review. First week, we talked a little bit about mean, median, mode, how to find those average scores. Then we talked about preponderance of evidence, and we talked about the frequency of evidence and the consistency of the evidence. Then we talked about measuring that evidence in a methodology that eliminates arbitrary dates and deadlines. Right now, I want you to focus on the fact that we're talking about evidence collection. Some people call that assessment, but it's really evidence collection. Evidence collection comes in a lot of different forms. Some people focus on tests, some focus on quizzes, some focus on projects, some focus on conversations, some do worksheets, some do projects. Doesn't matter. For our conversation, all of that evidence is good evidence. Just like in a court of law, a lawyer has to present a lot of evidence to prove a case. It's the same thing in classrooms. We need to have a lot of different evidence to prove whether or not somebody has got it or doesn't, whether or not they're guilty or innocent, however you want to frame that metaphor in your mind. That's what we're focusing on right now, is that this is all quality, admissible evidence. Got it? All right. So again, not formative, not summative, it's all assessment. All assessment changes our practice. Formatively makes us make some instructional decisions, and it's all summative because it's a way for us to demonstrate evidence and mastery. Last time we talked about the tic-tac-toe board and trying to get evidence that's consistent 3 times in a row. You could have conversations with your grade level or department and say, no, it needs to be 5 times or 2 times or 4 times. That's up to you. 3 times, that's an arbitrary number. Again, just like we're trying to get rid of arbitrary deadlines, an arbitrary number of 3, there's no research behind 3 other than it's consistent, and we know it's not just luck, it's a consistent expectation. So do what you want. Tic-tac-toe and 3 on a grid worked for me, but you can do what works for you. So today we're going to have the conversation about how do we decide which of those standards we're actually supposed to be teaching our kids. What is the what in our classroom? So we talked in the first week about, in my 8th grade social studies classroom, how I spent a lot of time talking about constitutional law. My counterpart spent a lot of time talking about the Civil War. Some classrooms spent a lot of time talking about narrative fiction and having kids read novels and read stories and focusing on comprehension and character analysis, while others focus on the writing process and citing textual evidence. Some classrooms focus on the scientific method and memorizing the periodic table, whereas others focus on Newton's laws of physics. Well, the state of Michigan, rightly or wrongly, has adopted the standards that we're to teach our kids. And I shared this with everybody at some point last year during one of our PDs. I threw the numbers up there just to show the absolute absurdity in the number of standards that our kids are supposed to be exposed to throughout the course of the year. Now, the standards simply say this is the expectation, this is the level you are to be teaching to, but there is what I call the Da Vinci Code of the standards. The state of Michigan actually shares it and publicizes it and tells us that there are some standards that are measured more than others. And we know this because the state of Michigan utilizes scale scores in their assessments. Scale scores are just another way of saying weighted scores. Some questions are worth more points than others, which is why you can't just look at a skill score, for example, of like a 680 and assume that means a kid got 680 questions correct. No, some questions might be worth 10 points in the scale weighting, others might be worth 5. Different questions carry with them different weights, so the scale score represents the aggregate or the total number of points a kid has earned, with some questions being worth more and some being worth less. The state of Michigan there also, and so does the SAT and College Board, tells us how they come up with their scores. In essence, they're looking for questions, A, that meet the standard and that have greater depth. Those that meet the actual grade level standard and those that have the greater amount of depth or are higher up on Webb's depth of knowledge or Bloom's taxonomy are worth more points. If I'm a classroom teacher, that's where I'm focusing my energies in. If I know that throughout a 180-day school year, there's no way I can teach my kids 66 standards to mastery, and I look through that and I identify that there's really only 10 to 15 that meet the requirements of depth, that have leverage, and are questions that require endurance, meaning they carry on to the next grade level, that's where I'm focusing my energies. And we've talked about the idea of having power standards or essential learnings in every course. And I'm going to challenge you to do that here. Here's an activity that I've done with my own staff when I was a building principal, both in Florida and in Michigan. And for the record, both of those schools showed off-the-charts gains in growth, not because of me, but because the teachers took back the power and took back this decision-making and owned it and eliminated arbitrary deadlines, focused on feedback, focusing on the stuff that matters, and the kids showed it. So let me just show you the quick little formula, the Da Vinci Code of determining power standards. First thing, determining the standards that have the most depth. Depth, if you remember Bloom's taxonomy, there are the various levels. One is knowledge or basic recall. Can a kid simply regurgitate back information? It comes in, they spit it back out the same way. The second level is comprehension or understanding. Can they process information in and then put it back out in their own words? Then there's application. Is it transferable? Can they get knowledge and information and then use it in a real world setting? Sort of like those word problems in math. Then there's analysis. Can they take a big abstract concept and break it down into its essential parts? Sort of like the key ideas in a story or in a text. Then there's synthesis, which is taking the key ideas and coming up with a big theme. It's taking individual pieces like a puzzle and putting it all back together again. Then you also have evaluation, which is basically making subjective opinions based off of objective evidence. So you're able to take all this evidence, come up with a theme, say it's good, bad, ugly, and why. And then there's creation. Are you able to create something that's original and unique based off of this high order of understanding? Something you need to understand very, very clearly is that this is not a rank order of difficulty. I've said this before. For me, those level 1 skills, those knowledge level skills are hard. I have a very difficult time memorizing information, regurgitating back facts. I can't tell you the names of generals and dates of Civil War battles. But again, going back to my social studies example, I can debate constitutional law. I can evaluate and synthesize information. So it's not necessarily a level of difficulty, it's a level of depth. What the state of Michigan has done and what the College Board has done is they put greater weight on those elements that carry with them greater depth. Because the research shows that elements that carry with them greater depth also have greater retention, meaning it gets lodged in the long-term memory and it becomes a skill that kids will remember well beyond the test. Again, our goal is to prepare kids for life, not just for life as a 12-year-old or a 17-year-old or a 6-year-old, but to give them skills and mindsets that actually endure. Research says higher order skills last longer than basic recall, which is why oftentimes our kids, we teach them information on Mondays, Tuesday, Wednesday, we give them a test on Friday. By the following Monday, they've already lost it. If that's the case, odds are something they had to cram for, they studied, they had flashcards for, which meant it was low-level recall and comprehension. If it's something they can study with flashcards and it's regurgitation and just memorizing, it's low-level. Not saying it's bad, not saying it's wrong, it's just not weighted the heaviest according to the big assessments. So one of the things that I did with my staffs, and I challenge you to do this in your student data meetings or your grade levels or your departments or by yourself, is take a look at your state standards. They're published right online. Just go to the Michigan Department of Ed, click on your subject area, and your standards will appear. You'll look and you'll see that you have somewhere between 30 and 70 standards, depending on what you teach. Then I want you to do a simple activity. I want you to just read through the standard and look for the following words: knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, evaluation, creation. And I have a bonus one on there, reflection. We'll talk about that. But look for those 7 words and give a number value to the standard based off of where it falls. If it's a knowledge standard, it gets a 1. Comprehension or understanding, a 2. If it's an application, it gets a 3. So if it says students will be able to apply, give it a 3. If it's an analysis, 4, so on and so forth. Then I want you to go through and I want you to look at the standard and say, which of these standards carries with it endurance? Which of these standards are essential for kids to truly master to be successful next year at the next grade level? Which of these standards don't just apply to my grade level, but the grade level above? If there's a standard that has endurance, that's not a one and done, go ahead and put a +2 next to it. Then I want you to look at standards that you consider to have leverage. Leverage meaning it's something that is transferable and could actually help them in another class. If you're a language arts teacher, is there a skill that would help them in science? If you're a science teacher, is there something that might help them in math? If there's a standard that you consider to have leverage, give it a 1. Long story short, on your list, you'll have a total. You'll have numbers next to a bunch of standards. The long and short of it is the standards that have the greatest number next to it. If you have a standard, for example, that is worth 10 points because it's a standard that deals with creation, which is 7, has endurance and leverage, 7 + 2 + 1, 10, you know that's one of your essential skills. That's an essential standard that you must teach to mastery. On your grid, on your tic-tac-toe board, that's going to be one of the standards you have. Why is leverage only worth 1? Well, odds are other subject areas are going to have a similar standard somewhere, so you don't have to own it all by yourself. Your grade level partner or your subject area department, they're going to help carry some of that burden too. So maybe you're just exposing kids to that content, but you don't have to focus on mastery. Why are knowledge and comprehension weighted so low? Isn't that important? Sure, you can cover that. You can teach kids a bunch of facts, but you're not going to hold up learning for an entire class because Johnny or Susie can't memorize something. Those might be those recursive skills that continue to come back and you continue to have the kids practice, but it's not going to be the end-all be-all. Those 10 things, 12 things, 15 things you put on your grid as essential that you're going to make sure kids are masters of become the things that you focus your attention on. The rest become your support. What we understand about teaching is that we all teach to the test. We don't necessarily just teach test-taking strategies and skills, but we all teach to the test. What we measure, we instruct. When we put our focus on 10 to 12 things that we say we're going to give grades on, that we're going to assess, that we're going to eliminate arbitrary deadlines on, that we're going to look for patterns of behaviors on, that becomes the area where we focus our energies. So K6, K8 language arts teachers, this was kind of the work we started last year when we started looking at those rubrics. We took the rubrics and we said, what are the 10 to 12 most essential standards our kids need to know? And then what would a level 1 look like? What would a level 2 look like? What would a level 3 look like? What would a level 4 look like? And we have rubrics to assess each of those standards. Now, the rest of us, we're not quite there yet. Right now, we've simply identified what are those things that go on our tic-tac-toe board. We understand that we're looking for patterns of scores and evidence. We're looking for consistency. We're looking for depth. We're looking for leverage. The next level is how do you measure that process? How do you measure the difference between a student that gets a 2 and a kid that gets a 3 on an assessment? Hold that thought. We'll get there. Right now, the focus is identifying which standards matter more. And you can't do this just by going into your book and saying, well, I guess I'm going to focus more of my energy on Chapter 2. What does Chapter 2 mean? What is the skill in Chapter 2? The purpose behind Chapter 2 is to help reinforce a skill, to reinforce instruction. Because if a kid isn't getting it, going back and saying, continue to read Chapter 2 over and over again is never going to let that kid get it. What is the skill? What's the content that you want kids to learn? When we start focusing in on the standards, the skills, the content, we'll then be able to make sure that our resources are aligned, our instruction is aligned, and that we're focusing on the focus. All right, have a great day.